Hi, my name is David. In our last unit, we talked about how God's kingdom and God's will should be read as two inseparable aspects of the expression of the presence of God. We noted that our ability to fully share in God's entire, glorious, eternal, immeasurable kingdom is shrouded and limited in this temporal world by three assertions about our human lives. First, the world is dominated by time, our temporal world, dominated by time. Second, our perception of our world is monitored by and limited to the abilities of our five senses. And third, as societies grow, we are everywhere, each and every one of us, more prey to the seductions of what I call the seven deadly sins. Those are, to run few through pride, greed, lust, envy, anger, and there's more. So the question is, should we undertake? Must we undertake? And how do we undertake that spiritual journey to move past these powerful masking assertions, these seductions that surround us, so that we can have a contented, useful life here on earth, but even more, so that we can break through and ascend beyond those temporal limitations, so we can venture into the fullness of existence in the universe of everything, which I call God's kingdom. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think we're each born with a spark of divinity inside of us. It's a spark that's a gift we are each given based simply on the plan of a loving God. And the purpose of our being here is to pursue a lifetime's journey of progress. And that's a progress towards spiritual perfection, towards it, all the while realizing that we can never actually achieve spiritual perfection. And yet, that's our job, to try to seek greater spiritual perfection as best we can. That's the covenant between us and God. So to do that, we have to look for information about how we should go about that lifetime pursuit. And that information would have to come from a power greater than ourselves. Because alone, we're clouded over by these three assertions, by time, by senses. On our own, we're blind to everything outside of our own little temporal world. Perhaps then, we're speaking of spiritual matters, we could get that information from a religious source. After all, the word religion comes from the Latin, means roughly a bond between humans and gods. So, let's look at major religions. In general, religions share these components. They are based on a sacred myth. They are supported by the authority of sacred laws and covenants. They develop a liturgy of ceremony, plus behavioral guidelines. And finally, over time, as they grow, they develop very powerful hierarchies. Let's play this out quickly with the Jewish and then with the Roman Catholic traditions. The Jewish faith is founded on the sacred myth of the Exodus. It starts with the redemption of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt, and it leads them through the wilderness to salvation in God's promised land, where they sin again. And their Old Testament myth ends with the promise of a Savior, which takes place, the promise, in Isaiah. By the way, by that term, sacred myth, it puts people off. I mean, no disrespect, not to hide anything. The word myth itself simply comes from the Greek word for story. And by sacred, I mean a story, but one so treasured by a people as to be considered bedrock truth. In other words, we don't mess with a sacred myth. It's at the very foundation of our beliefs. The Christian faith is founded on the sacred myth of the life of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament promised a Savior, right, in the Jewish sacred myth. Born of a virgin, Jesus of Nazareth is hailed as that Savior. He is born here, lives a divine life in this temporal world, suffers and dies in this world in order to redeem mankind, all mankind, from sin, rises from the dead, ascends out of this temporal world, and returns to his Father in the universe of everything, which is God's kingdom. Both of these myths address the need that we're discussing, which is to find a way to transcend the ties that bind us here in this temporal world. But religions have a tendency to build their own temporal world. These are worlds of writings and teachings and ceremony, but above all of hierarchies built to sustain the society that have the power to set and guard the rules. So we have here a critical shift. The original foundation in the sacred myth that fascinates us, that predominates at first. But as religion grows larger in a more complex society, hierarchy begins to replace sacred myth in terms of familiarity and preeminence with rules. Here's a chart of that shift. And you can see here that the sacred myth becomes less the most visible thing, but the hierarchy and the ceremony and the liturgy and the rules comes to be what we live by. The right thing to do becomes just to follow the rules. It's like somebody says, forget about it. Don't ask me any questions. It's all in the rules. Let's just follow the rules. Do what we're supposed to do. So if you say, what's a Catholic? If somebody says, well, that's going to Mass. And if somebody says, well, what's Jewish? They say, well, that's like Hanukkah. So that's what I mean. The problem is that hierarchy is all too human. And with hierarchy always comes the opportunity for power. With power and hierarchy come the temptations of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, lust, envy. And the problem is, together, religious organizations with their rules and their laws once again begin to blind us to our view of God's kingdom, because the dictum is just follow the rules, don't ask questions. So here's the great irony. What starts out as a glorious vision of God's kingdom, beyond the bounds of this temporal world, the one we said about, that's what I got to go find. That's what I want to go find. A personal redemption toward a life of serenity and spiritual integrity. That search, that journey still crashes up against these opaque boundaries of our temporal world. The things that cloud our vision, see, they aren't really gone after all. They've simply been redefined. And therefore, they can, and still do, block our way to that great transition into the fullness of life in God's kingdom. So, shoot. It seems we're stuck right back where we started. We're in here and can't get out. But I've been thinking about this a lot. What about the Beatitudes? The 8 Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount. Seems to me they kind of tell us what kind of person we should be. They show us what genuine blessed goodness looks like in a normal person. Maybe a person like you or like me. They tell us what kind of personal steps and attitudes we should develop to live like in accordance with God's will. They're not just a litany of thou shalt and thou shalt nots. They are, here's what it looks like when you do it. They tell us things like, making a lot of money just for the sake of making money. That isn't everything. They tell us we should really care for others and not be just selfish and self-centered. They tell us we should try and do the right thing, not just leap to that thing that's most convenient for us. We should be concerned and forgiving of others and not let our self-will run riot. We should make peace, not war. These don't seem like hard guidelines to follow. I looked up the number of mortal sins listed in the Roman Catholic religion. There's 48 of them listed. 48! Here's a portion of the list that I found. So in this first list, you can see things like euthanasia, suicide, scandal, drug abuse, gluttony, alcohol abuse. And now just for good measure, here's a few more. Terrorism, extreme anger, hatred, extortion, adultery, divorce, fornication, pornography. And that's not all of them. That's a whole lot of ways to go to hell, if you ask me. For a comparison, here are the 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. They're lessons to think about, and they're a little bit deep. They sound simple, but they're exactly how to live according to God's will. And I personally would rather focus on 8 examples for how to make spiritual progress than have to wrestle with 48 different ways to go to hell. And I think it's very, very instructive to note this. The Beatitudes come from Jesus of Nazareth personally, long before there were all these hierarchies, at least in the Christian church. The Beatitudes are in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. They're part of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you're in the Bible, in Matthew, and you turn the page, you turn one page, you find Matthew chapter 6, and right there, in Matthew 6, you find the Lord's Prayer. Here, let me show you. Here we are. This is chapter 5, book of Matthew, King James Version. And right here, you can see these are the 8 Beatitudes. This is them right there. Now watch this. If I turn one page, I'm in chapter 6 of Matthew, and here's the Lord's Prayer. Right there. So let's do that again, all right? Here's Matthew 5. There are the Beatitudes, one page. Here's the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6. They're right next to each other. Now, I can't speak for anyone but myself, maybe, but that sure doesn't seem like just some coincidence. It seems like they were meant to be presented together. My suggestion then is this. If you believe there is a God, a higher power, and you want to live in God's kingdom in accordance with His will here on earth, just as it is in heaven, go to the Bible and read over the Beatitudes. They're in Matthew 5, verse 3:10. And then I think you'll feel just a whole lot closer to getting where it is you want to go. Now, I know this unit's been long, and hey, I thank you for your patience. But next, we proceed with a truly astonishing, totally unexpected leap from trying to see out of this temporal world into God's kingdom, according to His will, how to make spiritual progress, only to find ourselves looking for breakfast, dude, right back here in our day-to-day world. And we're going to find out why. So, thanks for listening. I'll see you soon in the next unit.